The letter trembled in Florence's hands as she stood on the train platform in St. Louis, Missouri, her black mourning dress still carrying the faint scent of the funeral flowers that had surrounded her husband's casket 3 months prior. She had answered the advertisement for a mail order, bride not out of romantic hope, but out of sheer desperation, her late husband's debts having consumed everything she once called home, leaving her with nothing but grief and the clothes on her back. The journey west to Montezuma, Colorado in the spring of 1878 stretched before her like an endless ribbon of uncertainty, each mile taking her further from the life she had known and deeper into a future she could not imagine. Her husband Thomas had been gone for 92 days, and the weight of his absence still pressed against her chest like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe in the cramped passenger car as the locomotive pulled away from the station. Florence was 24 years old, and she felt as though she had already lived a lifetime of sorrow. The mountains rose up around the train like giants as they climbed into Colorado, their peaks still snow-capped despite the warming weather. Florence pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape transform from rolling plains into something wild and untamed. The other passengers chattered around her, but she remained silent, her thoughts a tangled mess of memories and fear. She had exchanged only 3 letters with the man who would become her husband, a mountain man named Randall Pierce, who lived in the high country above Montezuma and came down to town only when necessary for supplies. His letters had been brief and practical, outlining what he could provide: a sturdy cabin, protection, and a life far removed from the complications of civilization. He had not promised love or comfort or understanding, and Florence had not asked for any of those things. She needed only a place to exist, somewhere her creditors could not find her, somewhere she could disappear into the vastness of the Western Territories and let her broken heart beat out its remaining days in peace. The train deposited her in Denver, where she had to arrange passage on a smaller line that would take her into the mountains. The city bustled with activity, miners and merchants and women in fine dresses, all moving with purpose through streets that smelled of horse manure and coal smoke. Florence clutched her single carpet bag and made her way to the railway office, her movements mechanical, her mind still half lost in the fog of grief that had become her constant companion. The narrow-gauge railway that served the mining towns in the high country rattled and swayed as it climbed through mountain passes that made Florence's stomach drop. She had never seen such heights, such dramatic drops into rocky canyons where rivers ran white with snowmelt. The air grew thinner and colder, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, wondering what kind of man chose to live in such an unforgiving place. Montezuma was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of wooden buildings clustered in a valley surrounded by towering peaks. The town existed primarily to service the silver mines that dotted the surrounding mountains, and most of its residents were men who had come seeking fortune in the rich veins of ore. Florence stepped off the train onto a platform that was little more than a few wooden planks, her legs unsteady after so many days of travel. A man stood waiting at the edge of the platform, and Florence knew immediately that this was Randall Pierce. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, easily 6 feet and several inches more, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, slightly wavy and obviously in need of a trim. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of beard growth. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a striking gray blue that studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Miss Florence Livingston." His voice was deep and rough, like gravel rolling in a barrel. "Yes." Her own voice came out smaller than she intended. "Mr. Pierce?" He nodded once, then reached for her carpet bag without ceremony. "We have a climb ahead of us. My cabin is about an hour's ride up the mountain. I have a horse for you, gentle mare, nothing to worry about." Florence followed him through the muddy street to where 2 horses stood waiting, tied to a post outside what appeared to be a general store. The mare was indeed gentle-looking, a dappled gray with kind eyes. Randall secured her bag to his own horse, a massive black gelding that matched its owner in both size and presence. "You know how to ride?" He asked the question while checking the mare's saddle, his large hands moving with surprising deftness over the leather. "Some. It has been a while." Florence had ridden occasionally in her youth, before her marriage, before the world had narrowed down to a sick husband and mounting debts. Randall turned to her then, really looked at her for the first time. His eyes traveled over her morning dress, taking in the dark fabric and the drawn expression on her face. Something flickered in those gray-blue depths, something that might have been understanding or pity, but he said nothing about it. Instead, he moved to her side and laced his fingers together, creating a step for her to mount the horse. Florence placed her booted foot in his hands and felt herself lifted with such ease that she might have weighed nothing at all. The strength in this man was extraordinary, all hard muscle and controlled power. She settled into the saddle and arranged her skirts as modestly as possible, while Randall swung onto his own horse with fluid grace. They rode out of town without another word, following a narrow trail that wound up through pine forests and across streams swollen with spring runoff. The silence between them was not uncomfortable exactly, but it felt heavy with all the things they were not saying. Florence focused on staying seated and breathing the thin mountain air, watching Randall's broad back as he navigated the trail ahead of her. The cabin appeared suddenly as they crested a ridge, a sturdy log structure built against the mountainside, with a view that stretched for miles across valleys and peaks. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Florence realized with some surprise that Randall must have kept a fire going before coming down to meet her. A small barn stood nearby, along with a chicken coop and what looked like a root cellar built into the hillside. Randall dismounted and came to help her down, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her from the saddle. For a moment they stood close enough that Florence could smell wood smoke and pine, and something essentially masculine about him. Then he stepped back and gestured toward the cabin. It is not fancy, but it is solid. Keeps the cold out in winter and stays cool enough in summer. I've been trying to make it more suitable for a woman, but I may have missed some things. There was an uncertainty in his voice that seemed at odds with his imposing physical presence. Florence walked to the cabin door and stepped inside. The interior was one large room with a sleeping loft above, much cleaner and better organized than she had expected. An iron stove dominated one corner, radiating warmth. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the space, and she could see that new curtains had been hung at the windows, the fabric still stiff and showing the creases from where it had been folded in the store. "You did this?" She touched the edge of one curtain, noting the careful if somewhat clumsy stitching that held the hem. "Yes, I am not much good with a needle, but I tried." Randall had followed her inside, and now stood near the door, taking up space in a way that made the cabin feel suddenly smaller. "There is a bed in the loft. I have been sleeping down here by the stove. I will continue to do so until you are comfortable with other arrangements." The consideration in his words surprised Florence. She had assumed she would be expected to fulfill all wifely duties immediately, regardless of her own feelings or readiness. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I appreciate your understanding. I may live like a bear in the mountains, but I was raised by a good mother who taught me how to treat a lady." Randall moved to the stove and lifted a pot that had been simmering. "I made stew, nothing special, but it is hot and filling." They ate in continued silence, the stew simple but well-seasoned and satisfying after Florence's long journey. She found herself studying Randall when she thought he was not looking, taking in the way his muscles moved beneath his flannel shirt, the size of his hands around the tin cup of coffee, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was probably near 30, she guessed, and had clearly lived a hard life in these mountains. "We should speak about the arrangement," Randall said finally, pushing his empty bowl away. "I know this is not a conventional situation. I know you are in mourning." His eyes dropped to her black dress again. "I will not press you for anything you are not ready to give. We can take time to know each other, see if we can make a life together that is bearable at least, if not happy." Florence felt something crack in her chest, a tiny fissure in the wall she had built around her grief. "I do not know if I can ever be happy again," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "My husband died owing money to half of St. Louis. I loved him very much, and he was a good man, but his business failed, and he could not recover from it. The shame killed him more surely than the pneumonia. I have nothing left to give anyone, Mr. Pierce. I am empty." Randall was quiet for a long moment, his eyes steady on her face. "I have been alone in these mountains for 7 years," he said at last. I came out here after the war, after seeing things no man should see. I thought I wanted solitude, thought I could outrun the memories by putting them behind walls of rock and distance. But loneliness is its own kind of death, slow and cold. I am not looking for passion or grand declarations, Miss Livingston. I am looking for companionship, for another heartbeat in this cabin besides my own. If that is all you can give, then it is enough. Florence felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed in weeks. There was such honest longing in his voice, such simple human need. Please call me Florence. Then you must call me Randall. He stood and began clearing the dishes, his movements efficient and practiced. You must be exhausted from your journey. I will show you the loft and leave you to rest. The sleeping loft was accessed by a sturdy ladder, and Florence found it surprisingly cozy, with a real mattress filled with what smelled like fresh straw and pine needles. Quilts were piled high, and a small window looked out over the valley below. Randall brought up her carpet bag and then descended without lingering, giving her privacy to change into her nightgown and settle under the covers. Florence lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Randall moving around below, the crackle of the fire, the wind in the pines outside. She was in a stranger's cabin on a mountainside in Colorado, married in name to a man she had met only hours ago, and yet she felt safer than she had in months. The thought was so unexpected that she did not know what to do with it. Sleep came slowly, her mind replaying the day's events, circling back again and again to the image of Randall's gray-blue eyes and the gentleness in his rough voice. She had expected many things from this arrangement, but kindness had not been among them. Morning came with sunlight streaming through the small window and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Florence dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses, still black but less formal than her traveling clothes. When she descended the ladder, she found Randall at the stove, his hair damp as though he had already washed at the pump outside. "Good morning." He glanced over his shoulder at her. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in some time, actually." Florence accepted the plate he handed her, laden with bacon, eggs, and thick slices of bread fried in the bacon grease. "What are your usual routines? I would like to make myself useful." Randall settled across from her at the table. "I check my trap lines most mornings, hunt when we need meat. There's a garden plot that needs planting now that the ground has thawed enough. The chickens need tending, and I trade eggs and furs in town for supplies we cannot make or grow ourselves. In summer, I guide hunting parties sometimes, take rich men from the east up into the high country to shoot elk. It brings in good money." "I can manage the garden and the chickens," Florence said. "I am a decent cook, better than decent if I have proper ingredients. I can sew and mend. I kept house for my husband during his illness." They fell into a routine over the following days. Randall would rise before dawn and head out to check his traps, returning by mid-morning with whatever he had caught. Florence discovered that she liked the rhythm of the work, the simplicity of tasks that had clear beginnings and endings. She cleaned the cabin thoroughly, organized the supplies in the root cellar, and began planning the garden. Randall was a quiet presence, not given to excessive conversation, but Florence found she appreciated that. He did not pry into her grief or expect her to pretend to emotions she did not feel. Instead, he simply existed alongside her, a solid and dependable constant in each day. She noticed small kindnesses, the way he always made sure the wood box was full before she woke, how he brought her wildflowers one morning without comment or fanfare, just set them on the table in a jar and went about his business. 2 weeks after her arrival, Florence was working in the garden plot when she heard horses approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw Randall emerge from the tree line riding hard, his face tight with concern. Behind him rode 3 men she did not recognize, their clothes dusty and their eyes calculating as they surveyed the cabin and the land around it. Randall dismounted quickly and came to Florence's side, his body angling slightly in front of her in an unconsciously protective gesture. "Go inside," he said quietly. "What is happening?" "Please, Florence, just go inside and stay there." The urgency in his voice moved her to obey. Florence walked to the cabin, feeling the stranger's eyes on her back, and shut the door behind her. Through the window, she watched as Randall spoke with the 3 men, his posture tense, his hand never far from the rifle he wore slung across his back. The conversation was heated, though she could not make out the words. One of the men pointed toward the cabin, then up the mountain. Randall shook his head firmly, his arms crossed over his broad chest. The largest of the three strangers dismounted and stepped close to Randall, clearly attempting to intimidate with his size, but Randall stood his ground without flinching. Whatever he said made the man's face redden with anger. For a terrible moment, Florence thought violence would erupt. Her heart hammered in her chest as she watched the stranger's hand drop to the gun at his hip. But then Randall said something else, his voice carrying enough that she caught the words "legal claim" and "registered in Denver," and the tension seemed to deflate slightly. The three men remounted after several more minutes of discussion, their faces dark with frustration. They rode away without looking back, and Randall stood watching them until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did he turn and walk back to the cabin. Florence met him at the door. "What was that about?" Randall removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of stress she had not seen from him before. "Mining claim jumpers. There is silver in these mountains, and some men think they can take what belongs to others through intimidation or force. They wanted me to sell them my land for a fraction of what it is worth. When I refused, they suggested I might have an accident if I was not more cooperative." Fear coiled in Florence's stomach. Will they come back? Maybe. Probably. Randall met her eyes, and she saw something fierce and determined in his gaze. "But I will not be driven off my land, and I will not let anyone harm you." "That is a promise, Florence." The conviction in his words sent a shiver through her that was not entirely from fear. This man would protect what was his, and apparently he now counted her among those possessions. The thought should have rankled, should have made her feel like property, but instead, it made her feel valued in a way she had not experienced in a long time. "What do we do?" she asked. "We continue as we have been. I will ride into town tomorrow and speak with the sheriff, make sure he knows about the threats, and I will teach you to shoot, in case you ever need to defend yourself when I am not here." The shooting lessons began the next afternoon. Randall set up targets against the hillside and brought out a smaller rifle, one that would not knock Florence off her feet with the recoil. He stood behind her, his arms coming around to adjust her grip, his chest solid against her back as he guided her aim. "Breathe steady," he murmured near her ear. "Squeeze the trigger gently. Do not jerk it." Florence tried to focus on his instructions, but she was acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his body, the masculine scent of him. When the rifle fired, the kick still surprised her, and she stumbled back against him. Randall's hand steadied her, strong and sure. "Good," he said. "You hit the target. Try again." They practiced until her shoulder ached from the recoil and her ears rang from the noise. But Florence found she had a decent eye, and by the end of the session, she was hitting the center of the target more often than not. Randall's praise was sparing but genuine, and she felt a small spark of pride at having mastered something new. That evening, as they sat together after supper, Florence found herself studying Randall in the firelight. His face was half in shadow, the strong lines of his jaw and cheekbones making him look like something carved from the mountain itself. He was whittling a piece of wood, his knife moving with practiced precision, and she realized he was making a handle for a new garden tool. "You fought in the war," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Which side?" "Union. I was at Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, places I wish I could forget but never will." His knife paused in its work. "I saw men do terrible things to each other, saw boys younger than they should be die in mud and blood. When it was over, I could not go back to farming in Ohio like nothing had happened. So I came west, kept moving until I found a place remote enough that the memories could not follow me so easily." "Did it work? The isolation?" Randall looked up at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "For a while. But a man is not meant to be alone forever. The silence starts to feel like a punishment instead of a refuge." Florence understood that bone deep. Her own grief had isolated her just as surely as these mountains had isolated Randall. "I thought I wanted to disappear," she admitted. "When Thomas died and the creditors came, I thought if I could just vanish into the wilderness, the pain would somehow be more bearable. But it follows you, does it not? The sorrow?" "It does," Randall agreed quietly. But I am learning that perhaps it is more bearable when shared with another person who understands. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of kindred spirits finding each other against all odds. Florence felt her carefully constructed emotional walls trembling, felt something warm and fragile beginning to unfurl in her chest. It was not love, not yet, but it was the possibility of love, and that terrified her almost more than anything else. The spring days lengthened and warmed. Florence planted the garden with seeds Randall had purchased in town, beans and squash and potatoes, carrots and onions and lettuce. She tended the chickens and learned to make butter from the milk of the cow Randall brought home one day, having traded a stack of prime beaver pelts for the gentle Jersey. The rhythms of mountain life began to feel natural, the hard work satisfying in ways her previous life had never been. Randall taught her the names of the peaks that surrounded them, pointed out the best places to find wild berries and medicinal herbs. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of the animals. In turn, Florence brought order and comfort to his cabin, cooking meals that were more than just fuel, mending his clothes with neat stitches, adding small touches that made the space feel like a home rather than just a shelter. They talked more as the weeks passed, sharing stories of their pasts in pieces and fragments. Florence learned that Randall had been the youngest of 5 children, that his father had died when he was 12, leaving him to help run the family farm. He had joined the army at 19, full of patriotic fervor that the war had beaten out of him. He loved these mountains with a fierce passion, knew every trail and stream and hidden meadow. Randall learned that Florence had been educated at a girls' academy, that she could read Latin and play the piano, accomplishments that seemed frivolous now but had been the pride of her youth. She had married Thomas Livingston when she was 20, a love match that had seemed like a fairy tale until his dry goods business began to fail. She had nursed him through his final illness with devotion, and his last words had been an apology for leaving her with nothing. "He gave you love," Randall said when she finished the story. "That is not nothing." "No," Florence agreed softly, "but it did not pay the creditors." A month after Florence's arrival, Randall had to guide a hunting party into the high country, a commitment he had made the previous fall and could not break. He would be gone for 10 days, and Florence could see the worry in his eyes as he prepared to leave. "I do not like leaving you alone," he said, checking his gear for the 3rd time, "not with those claim jumpers still lurking around." "I will be fine. You taught me to shoot, and I know how to bar the door. The chickens and the cow will not tend themselves while you are gone." Florence tried to sound more confident than she felt. Randall pulled something from his pocket and handed it to her. It was a small derringer, the metal polished to a shine. "Keep this with you at all times. It only has 2 shots, but at close range it will stop a man." Florence took the weapon, surprised by its weight. "Randall, please." He covered her hand with his, the derringer between their palms. "For my peace of mind." She nodded, and he seemed to relax slightly. Then he did something unexpected. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead, his lips warm against her skin. "I will be back as soon as I can," he murmured. Florence stood in the doorway and watched him ride away, a strange ache in her chest that she did not want to examine too closely. The cabin felt enormous and empty without his presence, the silence oppressive in a way it had not been before she knew him. The first few days alone passed uneventfully. Florence kept herself busy with the garden and the animals, with baking and preserving the early greens that were ready for harvest. But on the 4th night, she woke to the sound of horses outside. Her heart leaped into her throat as she grabbed the derringer from under her pillow and crept to the window. In the moonlight, she could see 3 figures moving around the barn. The claim jumpers had returned, emboldened by Randall's absence. Florence's hands shook as she watched them. One of the men was trying to open the barn door while the others stood watch. They were clearly after the horses, or perhaps hoping to find something valuable stored inside. She knew she should stay hidden, should wait for them to take what they wanted and leave. But then one of the men turned toward the cabin, said something to his companions, and started walking in her direction. Florence felt ice flood her veins. She could not defend herself against 3 men, derringer or no derringer. She needed help. Moving as quietly as possible, she climbed down from the loft and slipped out the back window of the cabin, the one that faced the forest. The night air was cold against her skin, and she wore only her nightgown, but there was no time to dress. She ran barefoot into the trees, the pine needles soft under her feet, heading for the neighboring claim about 2 miles away, where an older prospector named Samuel lived. Florence ran until her lungs burned and her feet were cut and bleeding. She could hear the men shouting behind her, knew they had discovered her escape. Branches whipped at her face and arms, and she stumbled over roots in the darkness, but she did not stop. Samuel's cabin appeared like a blessing, lamplight glowing in the window. She pounded on the door, gasping for breath. "Please, help! There are men!" The door flew open, and Samuel stood there in his long underwear, a shotgun in his hands. He took one look at Florence's terrified face and wild appearance and pulled her inside. "What happened?" Florence explained in gasping bursts as Samuel loaded his shotgun and grabbed a rifle from the wall. He was 60 if he was a day, but his eyes were sharp and his hands steady. "You stay here and bolt the door behind me," he ordered. "I will go get the Morrison brothers from the next claim over. We will take care of those thieves." True to his word, Samuel returned an hour later with 2 burly men in tow. They had found the claim jumpers still at Randall's place, loading stolen supplies onto their horses. There had been a brief exchange of gunfire, but the thieves had fled when they realized they were outnumbered. No one had been hurt, and most of the supplies had been recovered. Samuel's wife, Martha, a kind woman with gray hair and worried eyes, insisted on tending to Florence's feet and giving her proper clothes to wear. "You were very brave," Martha said as she bandaged the cuts, "and very foolish. You could have been killed running through the forest in the dark." "I did not know what else to do," Florence whispered, the fear and adrenaline finally catching up with her. She began to shake uncontrollably. Martha wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and held her while she trembled. "You survived, dear. That is what matters." Florence spent the remainder of Randall's absence at Samuel and Martha's cabin, too frightened to return to the empty mountain home. The Morrison brothers kept watch on Randall's property, making sure the claim jumpers did not return. When Randall finally rode back into the valley, Samuel was waiting to intercept him and explain what had happened. Florence was helping Martha with the washing when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. She looked up to see Randall riding as though the devil himself was on his heels, his face a mask of fury and fear. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and strode toward her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, cataloging every visible injury. "You are hurt." His voice was tight and dangerous. "Just my feet, and they are mostly healed now. Randall, I am fine." He pulled her into his arms so suddenly and so tightly that the breath left her lungs. Florence stood rigid for a moment, shocked by the fierce embrace, and then she felt Randall shaking against her, his face buried in her hair. "When Samuel told me what happened, I thought I might lose my mind," he said roughly. "The thought of you running through the forest at night, terrified, bleeding." Florence's arms came up slowly to wrap around his waist, her hands spreading across the broad expanse of his back. "I'm all right," she said softly. "I am here, and I'm safe." Randall pulled back just enough to cup her face in his large calloused hands, tilting her head up so he could see her eyes. "I should never have left you alone. I knew it was dangerous, and I left you anyway. You had a commitment. We needed the money. I do not blame you, Randall." Something fierce and possessive flared in his gray-blue eyes. "You could have died, Florence. Those men could have hurt you in ways I cannot bear to think about. I've tried to give you space, tried not to push for more than you were ready to give, but I cannot lose you. I will not." Florence felt her breath catch. "Randall, I know you are still mourning your husband. I know you did not come here looking for love or any kind of real marriage, but I need you to know that I care for you. More than care. You have brought light back into my life, Florence. You have made me remember what it feels like to have something worth protecting, worth fighting for." Tears spilled down Florence's cheeks, hot and unexpected. She had been so carefully guarding her heart, so determined not to feel anything beyond gratitude and companionship. But the terror of that night, the relief of being held in strong arms, the raw emotion in Randall's voice, it all combined to shatter the last of her defenses. "I am frightened," she whispered. "I am frightened to care again, to give my heart again. What if something happens to you? What if I lose you like I lost Thomas?" Randall's thumbs brushed away her tears with infinite gentleness. "Life has no guarantees, Florence. I could die tomorrow, or I could live to be an old man. But I would rather have whatever time we are given, living fully and honestly, than waste years being afraid of what might happen. I think you feel the same, even if you are not ready to admit it." He was right, and Florence knew it. Somewhere between the shooting lessons and the quiet evenings by the fire, between the shared work and the stolen glances, she had begun to fall in love with this mountain man. She had been fighting it, denying it, but her heart had made its choice without consulting her head. "I do care for you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I thought I could ever care for anyone again. You have been so patient with me, so kind. You have made me feel safe and valued and seen." Randall's expression softened, and he leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Florence did not want to pull away. She wanted to feel alive again, wanted to embrace the possibility of happiness instead of hiding from it. When his lips met hers, the kiss was gentle and reverent, a question and a promise all at once. Florence kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and she felt heat bloom in her chest and spread through her entire body. It had been so long since she had been touched with desire, since she had felt wanted and cherished. Randall's arms tightened around her. She could feel the controlled strength in him, the careful restraint as he held back from overwhelming her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Randall rested his forehead against hers. "Come home with me," he said. "Let me take care of you properly. Let me show you every day that you are precious to me." Florence nodded, not trusting her voice. They said their goodbyes to Samuel and Martha, with Randall thanking them profusely for protecting Florence and offering to help with anything they might need in the future. Then he lifted Florence onto his horse and swung up behind her, holding her securely against his chest as they rode back to the mountain cabin. The ride was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence now, charged with anticipation and new understanding. Florence leaned back against Randall's solid warmth, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her spine, and allowed herself to hope for the first time in months. When they reached the cabin, Randall dismounted first and then reached up to lift Florence down, his hands spanning her waist. But this time, instead of setting her immediately on her feet, he held her suspended for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure about this? About us? I will not rush you if you need more time." "I have spent enough time grieving and hiding," Florence said firmly. "I am ready to live again, Randall, with you." He carried her across the threshold like a true bride, kicking the door shut behind them. Inside, he set her gently on her feet and began lighting lamps, his movements deliberate and careful. Florence watched him move around the space that had become familiar to her, seeing it now with new eyes. This was not just shelter anymore. This was home, and Randall was not just a protector or a companion. He was the man she loved. The realization settled over her like a warm blanket, comfortable and right. She had not thought she could love again after Thomas, had not wanted to risk the pain of loss. But Randall was different from Thomas in every way. Where Thomas had been gentle and intellectual, given to long philosophical discussions and careful planning, Randall was physical and present, a man of action rather than words. Thomas had needed her to be strong for him during his illness. Randall wanted to be strong for her. There was room in her heart for both of them, Florence realized. She could honor Thomas's memory while also embracing this new love that had found her in the wilderness. They were not in competition. They were different chapters in the story of her life. Randall turned from lighting the last lamp to find Florence watching him, her expression open and soft in a way he had not seen before. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am grateful for this second chance," Florence said. "That I did not expect to find happiness when I came here, but somehow I have found it anyway." Randall crossed to her in 3 long strides and took her hands in his. "I will spend every day trying to make sure you never regret choosing this life. Choosing me." "I could never regret it." Florence reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the scar through his eyebrow. "You saved me, Randall. Not just from the claim jumpers, but from drowning in my own grief. You gave me purpose and peace and a reason to keep going." "You saved me too," he said simply. "From loneliness and the ghosts of the past. We saved each other." That night, Florence climbed the ladder to the loft, but this time Randall followed her. They came together with tenderness and growing passion, learning each other's bodies and hearts, whispering promises in the darkness. Florence felt cherished and desired, felt her body awaken from the long sleep of mourning. Randall was gentle but thorough, patient with her inexperience with him, while also passionate enough to make her feel truly wanted. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, Florence's head resting on Randall's broad chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and she felt completely at peace for the first time since Thomas's death. "We should make this official," Randall said into the quiet. "Have a proper wedding ceremony, not just a paper arrangement. I want everyone to know that you are my wife in truth, that I am your husband." Florence lifted her head to look at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I would like that." They rode into Montezuma the following week and stood before the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. Samuel and Martha served as witnesses, along with the Morrison brothers and a handful of other locals who had come to know and respect Randall over the years. Florence wore a simple dress of deep blue that Martha had helped her make, the first non-mourning color she had worn since Thomas's death. Randall wore clean trousers and a white shirt, his hair neatly trimmed and his beard shaped. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Randall kissed Florence with such joy and tenderness that several of the watching women dabbed at their eyes. There was a small celebration afterward at the town's only restaurant, with music and dancing and genuine happiness. Florence found herself laughing as Randall spun her around the makeshift dance floor, his strength making it easy for him to lift and twirl her. "You are a good dancer," she said, surprised. "My mother insisted all her children learn," Randall replied with a rare grin. "Said it was the mark of civilization, even on an Ohio farm." They rode back to the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Florence felt lighter than she had in a year, as though she had finally set down a burden she had been carrying for too long. Thomas would always be a part of her past, but Randall was her present and her future. Summer arrived in full force, turning the high mountain meadows into carpets of wildflowers. Florence's garden flourished, and she spent long days tending the vegetables and preserving food for the coming winter. Randall took on more guiding work, bringing home money that allowed them to make improvements to the cabin and add to their small herd of animals. The claim jumpers did not return. Word had spread about what happened when they tried to intimidate Randall Pierce's wife, and about the community of miners and mountain men who had rallied to protect one of their own. The sheriff in Montezuma had made it clear that he would not tolerate such behavior in his jurisdiction, and the three men had moved on to easier targets elsewhere. Florence discovered that she loved life in the mountains. She loved the clean air and the spectacular views, the way the afternoon thunderstorms would roll through with dramatic fury and then leave everything fresh and sparkling. She loved the wildlife, the deer that would come to the meadow near their cabin at dawn, the eagles that soared overhead, even the cheeky marmots that tried to raid her garden. But most of all, she loved Randall. She loved his quiet strength and his unexpected tenderness, the way he would bring her small treasures from his time in the wilderness, an interesting rock, a perfect pine cone, a handful of wild strawberries. She loved his competence and capability, the way he could fix anything that broke and build anything they needed. She loved the way he held her at night, making her feel utterly safe and cherished. By late summer, Florence began to suspect that she was with child. She said nothing at first, wanting to be certain, but as the signs became unmistakable, she knew she needed to tell Randall. She chose a quiet evening when they were sitting outside the cabin watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Randall, I have something to tell you." Florence took his hand, lacing their fingers together. He turned to her immediately, alert to the serious tone in her voice. "What is it?" "I'm going to have a baby. Our baby." Florence watched his face carefully, unsure how he would react to such sudden news. For a moment, Randall simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming his usually serious features into something radiant with joy. "Truly, you are certain." "As certain as I can be without a doctor confirming it. But all the signs are there." Randall let out a whoop of happiness that echoed off the surrounding mountains and pulled Florence into his arms, spinning her around before setting her down carefully as though she had suddenly become fragile. "We are going to be parents," he said, wonder in his voice. "I'm going to be a father." "Are you happy about it?" Florence asked, even though his reaction had made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to cover what I am feeling," Randall said, cupping her face in his hands. "You have given me so much already, Florence. And now this, a child, our child. I feel like the richest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, despite the challenges of living in such a remote location. Martha proved to be an invaluable resource, having birthed 6 children of her own, and she taught Florence what to expect and how to prepare. Randall became almost comically protective, insisting that Florence not lift anything heavy or work too hard, hovering anxiously whenever she so much as stumbled. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Florence protested one afternoon when Randall tried to carry her over a small puddle. "Humor me," he said, his eyes crinkling with amusement, even as his concern remained genuine. "I have never done this before, and the thought of anything happening to you or the baby terrifies me." Florence softened, touching his cheek. "Nothing is going to happen. Women have babies every day, even in the mountains. We will be fine." Winter arrived early that year, bringing heavy snows that buried the cabin up to the windows. Randall worked tirelessly to keep paths clear and ensure they had enough firewood and supplies to last through the worst of the weather. Florence was grateful for the enforced quiet of the season, spending her days preparing baby clothes and blankets, knitting tiny socks and hats. They had decided not to find out whether they were having a boy or a girl, wanting to be surprised. Randall claimed he did not care either way, that he would be equally happy with a son or a daughter, but Florence caught him carving a small wooden horse one evening and suspected he might be secretly hoping for a boy. The baby arrived on a frigid February night in 1879, during a blizzard that made it impossible for Martha to reach them. Randall had to serve as midwife, following the instructions Florence had memorized from Martha's teachings. It was terrifying and messy and painful, but when their son finally emerged, wailing lustily into the world, both parents were overwhelmed with emotion. "A boy," Randall breathed, carefully wiping the baby clean with trembling hands. "We have a son, Florence." Florence, exhausted but elated, held out her arms for the baby. When Randall placed the tiny bundle against her chest, she felt a surge of love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. "He is perfect. Absolutely perfect." They named him Robert Thomas Pierce, honoring both Randall's father and Florence's first husband. It felt right to Florence, a way of connecting past and present, acknowledging that love and loss were both part of life's journey. Robert was a healthy, strong baby who inherited his father's lung capacity if his powerful cries were any indication. Randall was besotted, spending hours just watching his son sleep, marveling at the tiny fingers and toes. He carved an elaborate cradle for the baby, working late into the night to make sure every surface was smooth and safe. "You are going to spoil him," Florence said with amusement, watching Randall rock the cradle with one large foot while he cleaned his rifle. "A father's prerogative," Randall replied without a hint of shame. Spring returned, melting the snow and revealing a world fresh and new. Florence emerged from the intensity of new motherhood to find that she had fallen even more deeply in love with Randall, watching him transform into a devoted father. He would take Robert on his rounds when the baby was fussy, the motion and fresh air soothing the child, while Randall checked his traps and tended the animals. Life settled into new rhythms. Robert grew quickly, becoming a chubby, happy baby who smiled easily and rarely cried. Florence managed the household and the garden with the baby strapped to her back, finding that motherhood suited her in ways she had not anticipated. She had worried that having a child would remind her too painfully of what she had lost with Thomas, the future they would never have together, but instead, it felt like healing. She was building something new and beautiful, honoring the past while fully embracing the present. One evening, when Robert was nearly a year old and just beginning to take his first wobbly steps, Florence stood in the doorway of the cabin watching Randall play with their son in the meadow. The sunset painted everything gold, and she could hear Robert's delighted laughter as Randall pretended to be a bear, growling playfully while the baby toddled away on unsteady legs. It struck Florence then how completely her life had changed. 2 years ago, she'd been drowning in grief and debt, seeing no path forward except escape. She had come to these mountains expecting to merely survive, to exist in emotional numbness for whatever years remained to her. Instead, she had found love and purpose and joy. She had found a man who cherished her, a child who delighted her, and a home that fed her soul. Randall looked up and caught her watching, and the smile he gave her was full of such love and contentment that Florence felt her eyes well with tears. He scooped up Robert and walked back to her, the baby babbling happily and reaching for his mother. "What are you thinking about?" Randall asked, transferring Robert to Florence's arms. "About how grateful I am for this life, for you, for our family." Florence kissed Robert's soft hair, breathing in his sweet baby smell. "I never thought I could be this happy again." Randall wrapped his arms around both of them, enveloping his family in an embrace that felt like safety and home. "Neither did I, but here we are, happy beyond measure." The years that followed were full and rich. Robert grew into a sturdy boy with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's quick smile. When he was 3, Florence gave birth to a daughter they named Rachel Ann, a tiny, delicate thing who had Florence's auburn hair and Randall's stubborn determination. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Randall adding 2 more rooms and a proper bedroom for themselves on the main floor. The garden grew larger each year, and they added goats and pigs to their small farm. Randall built a workshop where he could do carpentry during the winter months, crafting furniture and tools that he sold in Montezuma for good prices. The mountain community became a tight-knit family of sorts. Samuel and Martha were like grandparents to the children, and the Morrison brothers, despite their rough exteriors, proved to have a soft spot for little ones, carving toys and telling outrageous stories. Florence organized a small school during the summer months, teaching not just her own children, but the handful of other youngsters scattered throughout the high country. When Robert was 7 and Rachel was 4, Florence gave birth to twin boys, a surprise that left Randall speechless with joy, and Florence wondering how she would manage 4 children in the wilderness. But they did manage, with love and hard work and the support of their community. The twins, named Roland and Richard, were as different as night and day despite being identical in appearance. Roland was quiet and thoughtful, while Richard was bold and adventurous. Life was not without its challenges. There were harsh winters when supplies ran low and sickness threatened. There were accidents and injuries inevitable in such a rough lifestyle. But through it all, Florence and Randall faced everything together, their love deepening with each passing year, each shared struggle, each triumph. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Randall surprised Florence by taking her on a trip to Denver. They left the children with Martha and Samuel, who were thrilled to have their honorary grandchildren for an extended visit. It was the first time Florence had been away from the mountains since arriving, and the bustle of the city felt strange and overwhelming after so much time in the wilderness. But Randall had planned everything carefully. He took her to a fine restaurant where they ate food they could never make at home. He bought her a beautiful dress in a color the clerk called emerald green, which brought out the gold flecks in Florence's hazel eyes. They stayed in a hotel with a real bathtub where Florence soaked for an hour, luxuriating in hot water she had not had to heat and haul herself. On their last night in Denver, they walked through the gas-lit streets, arm in arm like young lovers. Randall stopped in front of a jewelry store and pulled Florence inside, where he bought her a gold wedding band to replace the simple silver one he had given her originally. "You deserve something beautiful," he said as he slipped it onto her finger. "Something as precious as you are to me." Florence looked at the gleaming ring, then up at her husband's weathered, beloved face. "The most precious thing in my life is you, Randall. You and our children and the home we have built together. This ring is lovely, but what it symbolizes our love, our commitment, that is the true treasure." Randall pulled her close and kissed her there in the jewelry store, much to the clerk's amusement. "How did I get so lucky?" he murmured against her lips. "We both got lucky," Florence corrected. "Two broken people who found each other and became whole together." They returned to the mountains and their waiting children, but the trip had reinforced for Florence how much she loved her life in the high country. Denver was exciting for a visit, but it was not home. Home was the log cabin perched on the mountainside, with its magnificent views and its hard-won comforts. Home was the sound of her children's laughter and the warmth of Randall's arms at night. The children grew and thrived. Robert became his father's shadow, learning to trap and hunt and read the wilderness. Rachel proved to have a gift for growing things, taking over much of the garden work by the time she was 10. The twins were a whirlwind of energy, constantly exploring and getting into mischief that left Florence exasperated and Randall secretly amused. When Robert was 15, he asked his father if he could start his own trap line on the far side of the mountain. Randall agreed, proud of his son's growing independence, but also feeling the bittersweet ache of watching his children move toward adulthood. That night, he held Florence close and admitted, "I am not ready for them to grow up." "No parent ever is," Florence said gently. "But we have raised them well, Randall. They are strong and capable and kind. We have given them everything they need to make their way in the world." "When did you become so wise?" Randall asked, kissing her temple. "I had a good teacher," Florence replied. "You showed me how to live again, how to love without fear. That wisdom changed everything." As the years continued to pass, Florence would sometimes think back to that terrified, grief-stricken woman who had stepped off the train in Montezuma so long ago. She had been certain that her life was over, that she would never be anything but a hollow shell going through the motions of existence. How wrong she had been. Randall had given her a second chance at happiness, but more than that, he had given her the courage to seize it. He had been patient when she needed patience, strong when she needed strength, and loving when she needed love. Together, they had built something beautiful and enduring. The cabin on the mountain became known throughout the region as a place of hospitality and warmth. Florence and Randall took in miners who were injured or sick, fed travelers who were passing through, helped new arrivals learn the harsh lessons of mountain living. Their children grew up understanding that strength was measured not just in physical prowess, but in generosity of spirit. One autumn evening, when Florence was in her late 40s and Randall was nearing 55, they sat together on the porch they had built years earlier, watching the aspen trees turn gold in the fading light. Their children were all grown now, Robert married and working as a guide like his father, Rachel engaged to a good man who ran a sawmill in Montezuma, the twins off seeking their fortunes in the silver mines. "We should probably think about slowing down," Randall said, though there was no conviction in his voice. "Maybe spend more time in town during the worst of the winter." Florence laughed. "You would go mad cooped up in town for months, and I would miss my mountains too much." "Our mountains," Randall corrected, taking her hand. "Everything I have is ours, Florence. It always has been." She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had not diminished despite the passing years. "Do you ever regret it? Sending for a mail-order bride instead of finding someone locally, someone who already knew this life?" "Never," Randall said emphatically. "You were exactly what I needed, even if I did not know it at the time. You brought light and warmth and purpose back into my life. Every single day with you has been a gift." "Even the hard days?" Florence teased gently. "Especially the hard days, because we faced them together." Randall shifted to look at her directly. "I love you, Florence Pierce. I loved you when you arrived broken and grieving. I loved you when you learned to laugh again. I loved you through pregnancy and childbirth and raising 4 wild children. I will love you until my last breath and probably beyond that." Florence felt tears slip down her cheeks, happy tears that came from a heart overflowing with contentment. "I love you too, Randall. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. You gave me a reason to live when I thought I had none left. You gave me a family and a home and more happiness than I ever thought possible." They sat together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange and purple. The air grew cold, and eventually they would go inside to the warmth of the fire and the comfort of their bed. But for now, they simply sat and watched the day end, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that was exactly what they both needed. Inside the cabin, the walls were covered with memories, photographs of their children at various ages, Randall's first attempt at whittling, now polished smooth by years of small hands playing with it, the blue dress Florence had worn to their wedding ceremony hanging in a place of honor. Every object told a story, every corner held a memory. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Florence thought about the journey that had brought her here. Thomas would always hold a place in her heart, her first love, and a good man who deserved to be remembered with affection. But Randall was her great love, the one who had shown her that it was possible to rise from the ashes of loss and build something new and beautiful. The mountain life had been hard at times, demanding more strength and resilience than Florence had known she possessed, but it had also been infinitely rewarding, teaching her what really mattered in life. Not wealth or social position or the things she had once thought important, but love and family and the satisfaction of work well done. She had learned to find joy in simple pleasures: the first tomato from the garden, the sound of her children's laughter, the warmth of Randall's hand in hers. Winter came again, as it always did, bringing snow that transformed the world into something pristine and magical. Randall and Florence settled into the quiet rhythms of the cold season, spending long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other and planning for the spring. They received letters from their children, news of grandchildren on the way, and felt blessed beyond measure. On Christmas, the children all came home, filling the cabin with noise and love and chaos. Florence cooked for days, preparing all their favorite foods, while Randall told stories to the grandchildren and pretended to grumble about all the disruption. But Florence could see the joy shining in his eyes, the deep satisfaction of being surrounded by the family they had created together. After everyone had left and the cabin was quiet again, Randall pulled Florence into his arms and danced her around the main room to music only they could hear. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" Florence asked, though she thought she knew. "For saying yes to a stranger's advertisement, for coming to these mountains, for giving me a chance when you had every reason to refuse, for loving me and building this life with me." Randall's voice was rough with emotion. "For everything, Florence. Thank you for everything." Florence kissed him with all the love in her heart, this man who had taken her broken pieces and helped her become whole again. "Thank you for showing me that it was possible to love again, that a heart could break and still heal, still open to new joy. You are my miracle, Randall Pierce." They stood together in the lamplight, swaying gently, two people who had found their way through loss and loneliness to something precious and enduring. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountains in white silence. Inside, the fire crackled and the cabin held them safe, a testament to everything they had built together. The years ahead would bring their own challenges and changes. There would be more grandchildren to spoil, more winters to endure, more summers to enjoy. There would be losses too. Samuel passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 82, and Martha followed him 6 months later, as though she could not bear to be parted from her husband of 60 years. Randall and Florence mourned their friends deeply, but took comfort in the example they had set, a love that lasted until death and probably beyond. As Randall and Florence grew older, they finally did spend more time in Montezuma, though they never gave up the mountain cabin entirely. It remained their true home, the place where their hearts belonged. They became the wise elders of the community, the couple everyone pointed to as an example of what marriage could be when two people were truly committed to each other. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, Florence looked across the crowded cabin at Randall and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. He had grown gray, and his movements were slower, but he was still the strong, steady presence that had anchored her life for 4 decades. That night, after everyone had left and they were alone again, Randall led Florence outside to look at the stars. The night was clear and cold, and the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. They stood close together, sharing warmth, looking up at the vastness above them. "Do you remember the first time we stood here like this?" Randall asked. "The night you told me you were pregnant with Robert?" "I remember everything," Florence said. "Every important moment, every quiet evening, every time you made me laugh or held me when I cried. It is all here." She placed her hand over her heart. I am a lucky man," Randall said simply. "We are both lucky," Florence corrected, as she had so many times over the years. "Lucky to have found each other, lucky to have had this life together." They stood under the stars, two people who had been brought together by circumstance and had chosen to transform that circumstance into something beautiful. Florence's heart, which had been so heavy with loss when she first arrived in these mountains, was now full to overflowing with love and joy and the peace that comes from a life well lived. Randall pulled her close, his arms still strong enough to hold her, his love as steady and reliable as the mountains that surrounded them. "I would do it all again," he murmured into her hair, "every single moment exactly the same." "So would I," Florence whispered back, without hesitation, without regret. "Every moment with you has been a blessing." And there, on the mountainside where they had built their life together, they held each other and looked out over the world they had claimed as their own. Florence thought about the woman she had been, arriving with nothing but grief and despair, and the woman she had become, rich in love and family and purpose. The transformation had been possible because of Randall's steady love, his unwavering support, his willingness to give her time and space to heal. But it had also been possible because Florence had been brave enough to open her heart again, to take the risk of loving after loss. She had learned that the human heart is resilient and capable of remarkable regeneration. She had learned that happiness is not a finite resource that can only be experienced once, but something that can bloom again and again if you are willing to nurture it. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that was answered by others in its pack. Florence felt Randall's arms tighten around her, his instinct to protect her as strong as ever, and she smiled against his chest. This was love, she thought, not just the passionate romance of youth, though they had certainly had that too, but the deep, abiding connection that comes from weathering life's storms together. It was choosing each other every day, through the mundane and the extraordinary. It was building something greater than either of them could have created alone. As they finally turned to go back inside, Florence took one last look at the mountains silhouetted against the starry sky. These peaks had witnessed their entire story, from her arrival as a frightened widow to this moment of profound contentment. They had been the stage for every triumph and every struggle, the constant backdrop to a love story that had defied expectations and flourished against all odds. Inside the warm cabin, Randall banked the fire for the night while Florence changed into her nightgown. When they finally settled into bed, fitting together as naturally as they had for 40 years, Florence felt completely at peace. Her journey from loss to love had been long and difficult, but every step had been worth it to arrive at this place of belonging. "Sweet dreams, my love," Randall murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Sweet dreams," Florence replied, her hand finding his in the darkness and holding tight. And as sleep claimed them both, Florence's last thought was one of profound gratitude. She had come to these mountains looking for escape, and had found instead a home, a family, and a love that had healed every broken place in her heart. Randall Pierce, the mountain man with his quiet strength and steady devotion, had shown her that it was possible to love again after loss, to build new joy on the foundation of old sorrow. Their story was one of second chances and unexpected blessings, of two lonely souls finding each other in the wilderness and creating something beautiful together. It was a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the transformative power of love. And high on that mountain in Colorado, in a cabin built by strong hands and filled with years of memories, two people slept peacefully in each other's arms, their hearts no longer heavy with loss, but light with love, and the certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged. The years continued to pass gently. Randall and Florence grew old together with grace and gratitude, never taking a single day for granted. They watched their children thrive and their grandchildren grow, secure in the knowledge that they had created a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. When Randall finally passed away at the age of 78, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Florence holding his hand. She mourned him deeply, but without the devastating despair that had consumed her after Thomas's death. This was different. This was the natural completion of a life fully lived, a love fully expressed. She had no regrets, no words left unsaid, no love left ungiven. Florence lived another 5 years, surrounded by family and spending her final days in the mountain cabin that had been the site of so much happiness. When her time came, she went with a smile on her face, her last words a whisper of Randall's name. They were buried side by side on the mountain they had loved, with a view of the valleys and peaks that had witnessed their entire story. The headstone was simple, listing their names and dates, but also bearing the inscription that their children had chosen, "Two hearts made whole by love." And the cabin on the mountain continued to stand for generations afterward, home to their descendants who inherited not just the property, but the legacy of what Florence and Randall had built together. It stood as proof that love can heal the deepest wounds, that second chances are possible, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is open their heart again after it has been broken. Florence Livingston Pierce had arrived in Colorado as a mail-order bride with a heart heavy from loss, seeking only to survive. But Randall Pierce, with his steady love and quiet strength, had shown her that surviving was not enough. He had taught her to truly live again, to love without fear, to embrace the possibility of happiness even after experiencing profound sorrow. Their love story became the stuff of family legend, passed down through the generations as an example of what marriage could be when two people were truly committed to each other. It was a story of healing and hope, of finding unexpected joy in the wilderness, of building a life together one day at a time with patience and devotion. And though both Randall and Florence eventually returned to the earth they had loved so well, their love remained, woven into the fabric of the mountain itself, an enduring testament to the power of two hearts choosing each other and never letting go.